For months, the Kremlin appeared to be preparing for something much larger than another local attack. Across the Zaporizhzhia front, more than 65,000 Russian troops, including VDV airborne formations, Spetsnaz units, artillery brigades, and mechanized forces, were gradually assembled for what many analysts believed could become Russia's next major offensive in southern Ukraine. The objective was clear. Moscow wanted a path toward Zaporizhzhia, a city it had failed to capture since the beginning of the war, despite years of fighting and enormous losses. By May 2026, the buildup looked powerful enough to finally change the situation. Then something unexpected happened. The troops were in position. The ammunition was in place. The assault units were ready. Yet the offensive itself began losing momentum before the breakthrough had even started. Convoys slowed. Assault routes became increasingly dangerous. Critical movements that once took minutes suddenly carried consequences lasting days. And behind all of it stood a problem far smaller than the army it was affecting. Because campaigns do not always fail when soldiers run out of ammunition or when tanks are destroyed. Sometimes they fail when an army discovers that every road forward is becoming more dangerous than the last. And by the time Russian commanders understood what was happening near Zaporizhzhia, more than 65,000 troops were already moving toward a trap that was beginning to close. The buildup did not happen overnight. For months, Russian forces steadily expanded their presence across the Zaporizhzhia front, transforming the sector into one of the largest concentrations of combat power in southern Ukraine. By May 2026, more than 65,000 troops had been assembled along the axis. VDV airborne formations arrived alongside Spetsnaz detachments, mechanized units, artillery brigades, and electronic warfare teams. New ammunition depots appeared behind the front. Fuel reserves increased. Assault groups rotated into forward staging areas. Every week, the force grew larger. The objective was not difficult to identify. Zaporizhzhia remained one of the most important Ukrainian cities beyond Russian control. Capturing it would deliver a major political victory for the Kremlin, while placing additional pressure on Ukrainian defenses across a much wider section of the southern front. On paper, the conditions appeared favorable. Russia possessed manpower, artillery, armored vehicles, and months of preparation. The offensive seemed to have everything it needed. Everything except freedom of movement. Because while the army was growing larger, the number of safe routes leading toward its objective was quietly shrinking. Most Russian commanders did not see the danger yet. Ukraine did. And sooner or later, the entire offensive would be forced through the same narrow corridor. The corridor Ukraine was watching led to a place most people would overlook in seconds: Stepnohirsk. From the air, it looked unremarkable. A small settlement sitting south of Zaporizhzhia, surrounded by open ground and scattered villages. Yet military campaigns are often shaped by places that appear insignificant until an army needs to move through them. For Russian planners, Stepnohirsk was more than a town. It sat beside one of the most important road networks supporting operations toward Zaporizhzhia. Fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, armored reinforcements, engineering vehicles, and assault formations all depended on the same corridor to maintain momentum. That dependence created a problem. As Russian combat power increased, so did the burden on the route supporting it. More battalions required more fuel required more trucks created more traffic, and more traffic created more opportunities to be detected, tracked, and targeted. What appeared to be growing strength was quietly creating growing vulnerability. Russian commanders looked at the corridor and saw the fastest path towards Zaporizhzhia. Ukrainian planners looked at the same map and saw something entirely different. They saw a bottleneck. And once a major offensive becomes dependent on a bottleneck, the battle is no longer decided by how many troops stand behind it. It is decided by what happens inside the bottleneck itself. Russian commanders were not blind to the drone threat. By the time the buildup around Zaporizhzhia reached its peak, they understood that any large-scale offensive would be watched from the air. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones had spent months tracking movement across the sector, identifying supply routes, staging areas, and recurring patterns that appeared again and again. Russia responded. One logistics unit reportedly shifted much of its movement to nighttime hours after repeated drone sightings along a key route leading toward the front. Other convoys altered schedules, changed departure points, and increased coordination with electronic warfare teams. Additional EW systems were deployed near critical corridors while reconnaissance flights expanded across the sector. Some of these measures reduced exposure. None removed the problem. Every adjustment came with a cost. Night movements slowed deliveries. Longer routes consumed additional fuel. Electronic warfare systems required protection, maintenance, and constant resupply. The larger the buildup became, the harder it became to conceal. Russian planners viewed the challenge as a surveillance problem. Ukraine viewed it differently. It was not trying to stop every convoy moving towards Zaporizhzhia, it was trying to understand how the offensive functioned. Which routes carried fuel? Which routes carried ammunition? Which movements could be delayed without being noticed immediately? That difference mattered. Russia was trying to reduce exposure. Ukraine was trying to understand behavior. Because once the rhythm of the offensive became predictable, every repeated movement created a new opportunity to observe, anticipate, and react. The danger was not that every convoy would be attacked. The danger was that every convoy might eventually be expected. And sooner or later, one of those moments would force Russian commanders into decisions they had only minutes to make. The most dangerous part of the corridor was not where Russian units were attacked. It was the moment they realized they had been seen. One Russian fuel convoy reportedly slowed near a crossroads south of Stepnohirsk after encountering a damaged vehicle abandoned beside the road. The delay lasted less than a minute. Drivers adjusted their spacing. Vehicles shifted position. The column continued moving. From the ground, nothing appeared unusual. From the air, a pattern had just revealed itself. A Ukrainian reconnaissance drone tracked the slowdown and relayed updated coordinates. Suddenly, a situation that looked routine became a decision problem. Continue forward, disperse, move on to a secondary route. Pause and wait for additional reconnaissance. None of the options guaranteed safety, and none came with complete information. That was the reality Russian commanders were increasingly confronting. Once movement was exposed, they often had only a narrow window to react before the risk of artillery fire, FPI strikes, or continued surveillance increased sharply. In several sectors, officers described that window as roughly 8 minutes. 8 minutes sounds manageable. On a battlefield, it disappears quickly. A driver checks a route. A commander waits for confirmation. A convoy slows. A decision arrives a little too late. And every delay creates another opportunity for the enemy. What made this dangerous was that Ukraine did not need to destroy every convoy moving towards Zaporizhzhia. It only needed to force the offensive into making more decisions than it could comfortably manage. And those decisions were beginning to consume something Russia could not easily replace: time. The consequences of the 8-minute zone did not end on the road. They followed Russian units all the way to the front. One fuel convoy that normally reached forward positions before dawn now arrived hours later after repeatedly changing routes to avoid suspected drone activity. By the time the trucks reached their destination, an artillery battery had already reduced its firing schedule, and an assault group was still waiting for support that had not arrived. Nothing had been destroyed, yet the offensive was already slowing down. That was the problem Ukraine was exploiting. Modern offensives depend on timing. Reconnaissance drones identify targets. Artillery prepares the battlefield. Electronic warfare systems suppress threats. Assault units move forward at the right moment. Each element depends on the others. When one part slows down, the entire sequence begins adjusting around it. A delayed fuel delivery postpones artillery support. Delayed artillery postpones an assault. A postponed assault gives Ukrainian surveillance teams more time to observe movement, identify patterns, and prepare new responses. Small delays begin producing larger ones. Russian forces still possessed troops, armored vehicles, and firepower. What they were increasingly losing was synchronization. The closer they moved toward Zaporizhzhia, the harder it became to keep thousands of soldiers, vehicles, and support systems operating on the same timetable. Russia was not running out of troops, it was running out of time. and time was becoming the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. By this stage, Russian commanders were confronting a problem that additional manpower could no longer solve. The offensive still had troops, it still had artillery, it still had armored vehicles. What it increasingly lacked was concentration. Resources that had originally been intended to support a breakthrough were now being diverted to preserve movement itself. Additional escorts appeared along logistics routes. Electronic warfare systems spent more time protecting convoy corridors. Reconnaissance assets that could have supported offensive operations were increasingly tasked with monitoring roads and identifying potential threats before supply columns moved through them. Each adjustment made sense on its own. Together, they revealed a deeper problem. The offensive was beginning to consume resources simply to keep itself functioning. A convoy that once moved with minimal protection now required additional escorts. Reconnaissance drones spent more time watching roads than supporting assaults. Electronic warfare teams increasingly focused on shielding logistics corridors rather than helping offensive formations push forward. None of these changes looked dramatic on their own, but collectively, they were shifting resources away from the breakthrough and toward the effort required to sustain it. Russian forces were still advancing in some areas. Local attacks continued. Artillery batteries remained active, but more and more effort was being spent defending the system behind the offensive rather than strengthening the offensive itself. That is how operational traps begin to close, not when an army runs out of strength, but when it starts using its strength to protect vulnerabilities instead of creating opportunities. And by now, the consequences were no longer limited to the road leading towards Zaporizhzhia. At first glance, the pressure building around Stepnohirsk appeared to be a local battlefield problem. It was not. The same road network supporting operations towards Zaporizhzhia also connected to the wider logistics system stretching south toward Crimea. Fuel convoys, ammunition shipments, replacement vehicles, and engineering equipment all moved through parts of the same transportation architecture. That meant disruptions near Stepnohirsk rarely stayed near Stepnohirsk. A convoy delayed north of the town could affect deliveries farther south. Additional escorts assigned to one route became unavailable somewhere else. Vehicles forced onto longer roads consumed more fuel, more maintenance hours, and more time before reaching their destination. At first, these looked like isolated inconveniences. Then they started accumulating, and that was where the real danger emerged. Russian planners were no longer dealing with a problem affecting only the Zaporizhzhia offensive. They were beginning to face a situation where protecting one priority could weaken another. More attention devoted to sustaining momentum towards Zaporizhzhia meant fewer resources available elsewhere. Increasing protection around key supply corridors came at the expense of flexibility across the wider southern theater. Russian planners were no longer deciding where to apply more pressure. They were beginning to decide what they could no longer afford to protect. Stepnohirsk was no longer just a gateway. It was becoming a place where the demands of Zaporizhzhia and the demands of Crimea were beginning to collide. The growing pressure around Stepnohirsk exposed a problem that could not be measured in kilometers or artillery shells. It exposed a problem of expectations. For years, VDV airborne troops and Spetsnaz units occupied a special place in Russia's military image. They appeared in recruitment campaigns, military parades, and state television broadcasts. These were the formations Moscow often showcased as proof that difficult battlefield problems could still be solved when conventional forces struggled. That reputation was one reason so many elite units were committed to the Zaporizhzhia sector. The expectation was straightforward. If anyone could force open the door to Zaporizhzhia, it would be them. Yet after months of fighting, the door remained closed. Assault groups continued launching attacks. Artillery batteries continued firing. Reconnaissance teams continued searching for weaknesses. Individual positions changed hands. Local engagements were won and lost. But the larger problem remained. The offensive still could not generate the momentum needed to turn tactical gains into a breakthrough. That distinction mattered. Winning a trench line is not the same as opening a route. Destroying a position is not the same as sustaining an advance. One Russian military commentator summarized the frustration bluntly: "We keep taking ground. We don't keep the initiative." And that was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable reality. Because if the formations presented for years as the answer to Russia's hardest battlefield problems could not open the door to Zaporizhzhia, it was becoming harder to explain who could. In the end, the battle for Stepnohirsk was never really about Stepnohirsk. It was about momentum. For months, Russia assembled more than 65,000 troops across the Zaporizhzhia sector. VDV formations, Spetsnaz units, artillery brigades, armored forces, fuel depots, and logistics networks were all positioned for an offensive intended to change the battlefield in southern Ukraine. The force arrived. The breakthrough never did. That is what makes this story significant. Ukraine did not stop the offensive by destroying every convoy, every artillery battery, or every assault group moving toward the front. Instead, it focused on something far more difficult for a large army to replace: time. Every delayed convoy created another delay somewhere else. Every rerouted supply column consumed additional fuel. Every pause gave Ukrainian surveillance teams another opportunity to observe, track, and react. Small disruptions accumulated until preserving movement became almost as important as creating progress. That is the hidden cost of standing still in modern warfare. An army can replace vehicles. It can deploy reinforcements. It can replenish ammunition. What becomes far harder to replace is momentum once it begins slipping away. Russia still had troops. It still had artillery. It still had elite units. What it increasingly lacked was the freedom it expected when the offensive began. For months, Moscow built an army for a breakthrough. In the end, the breakthrough was not stopped by a lack of strength. It was stopped by a road that became too dangerous to ignore. And once that road began to close, more than 65,000 troops found themselves fighting for momentum they could no longer control. If you were planning this campaign, what matters more? Having 65,000 troops, or having one road the enemy cannot control? Let us know in the comments below.